Ever since Star Wars The Force Awakens, we've seen a major uptick in fanservice that heavily utilizes nostalgia, like bringing back old characters, famous props, memorable set pieces, and references and callbacks to the past. The general response to fanservice is extremely divisive because in some cases it can come across as exploitative, and other times it can be well integrated. Ever since Spider-Man No Way Home came out, I feel like it's been a good example as to how to do fanservice correctly, although it's still not perfect. So I want to compare and contrast the good and bad examples while going over the three main pillars that make up great nostalgia-based fanservice. The first one is that it needs to have a purpose within the story. If it's just there for the sake of nostalgia, then it can immediately come across as disingenuous. This is where Spider-Man No Way Home really shines, because the old villains from the prior Spider-Man movies actually have character growth. Obviously not all of them have a lot of character growth because there are 5 of them, but the best example in the group is Dr. Octavius. We see him go from being essentially in his villain prime of hating Spider-Man to Peter Parker fixing the hardware that's driving his mind insane, and him going back to being a good person. The writers don't use Dr. Octavius as a one-trick means to garner nostalgia from fans. These villains are a large part of the focus, and by continuing their story in a satisfactory way, these old characters blend into the new story to find meaning. And we don't just have character growth for Dr. Octavius, his conflict heavily influences Peter's character arc. In the movie, he learns that he'll be partially responsible for the death of these villains by sending them back to their timelines, and it's possible to find another way to save their lives by curing them, which goes against the stereotypical hero defeating the villain stereotype. So the old villains positively impact the story because they force Peter Parker to change. And they also go through new and interesting dynamics that don't come across as a retread, like the villains interacting amongst one another and having some cool dialogue, their interactions to seeing a new Spider-Man and being in a different universe that has new mechanics like magic, more dynamic action, and having a mostly new story. Also, I haven't even touched on the fact that we have returning Spider-Man who get their own redemption and closure, since some of their stories ended prematurely. Comparing this to something like Star Wars The Force Awakens, the very purpose of its own fanservice is questionable because of how much of a retread the whole movie is. When lining up A New Hope and The Force Awakens, the plot becomes alarmingly identical. We have one of our main protagonists who gets ambushed by a villain, who's similar to Darth Vader, and before getting captured, he sends away a droid with sensitive information. Then the droid happens to run into a Force-sensitive person who doesn't know their parents and escapes off-world in the Millennium Falcon. They meet an old, experienced character that ushers them into an expansive story, who ends up dying to the main villain, and motivates our heroes to take down the Empire, the First Order, and destroys the Death Star or Starkiller base. But yeah, you get the point. So by crafting a story that is almost indistinguishable to A New Hope, it garners a lot of exploitative nostalgia because they're redoing an old story but with a new layer of paint. And all the while, The Force Awakens is being advertised as a whole new story. So the purpose here for the movie seems like a cheap and scientific way to make as much money as possible by mining nostalgia from fans. You can kind of argue the same for Spider-Man No Way Home, but for that movie, they actually tried to do something new. Meanwhile, in The Force Awakens, a lot of the nostalgia-inducing aspects in the movie are contrived, like the Millennium Falcon coincidentally being on Jakku, and Rey being able to expertly fly the ship doing extremely advanced maneuvers that not even TIE Fighter pilots could keep up with. And it's also convenient that the second they take the Millennium Falcon off-world, they immediately bump into Han Solo and Chewie, so they can have this nostalgia feels-good line.
Chewie, we're home.
Or even Maz Kanata randomly having Luke Skywalker's lightsaber for some reason, and she says this.
Where'd you get that?
A good question. For another time.
It's very clear that the story in this movie comes secondary to the fan service, and since that's the case, once the nostalgia rose-tinted glasses effect wears off, the movie becomes much worse, and we actually see the flaws for what they are. For the second pillar of great fan service, it has to follow the internal logic of the movie, or in other words, it has to make sense within the established rules of the movie's world. This is where I think Spider-Man No Way Home could be improved, because the rules of the multiverse and how Doctor Strange's spell works can be a bit confusing and inconsistent. Like, one of the main conveniences is that the only 2 Spider-Man and villains that show up are people we already know as an audience. In theory, there should be other renditions of these characters leaking through, and the fact that it's only characters we are familiar with is convenient for the story. despite that being the most practical direction to take the story because you can't just set up a bunch of different people we don't know. So personally, this aspect does not bother me, and it's at least plausible to happen. But for other movies, the writing is a lot worse or just straight up contradictory for how they set up the fanservice segments. The most glaring example is Ghostbusters Afterlife, and as a quick warning, I'll be going into some spoilers for the movie, but it's been out for a while, so if you wanted to watch it, you probably would have by now. When the main character, who's Egon's daughter, finds her way into a jail cell, she decides to call the old Ghostbusters number for her one phone call. Which in of itself is absurd that a child wouldn't call their parent in this scary situation, but whatever. When talking to Ray from the first movie, he says this.
One morning I go to work, an Ecto-1, our old Cadillac is gone, his neutrino thrower, collider pack, all the traps, 16 ounces of fuel isotope, all gone. He cleaned us out.
But at the end of the movie, when our heroes are in need of help, Peter Venkman, Ray, and Winston miraculously show up to save the day. However, this moment is immediately contradicted by what the writers told us earlier in the movie in that phone conversation. So how did they get their equipment back when Egon supposedly cleaned them out? The writers just seem to hope that the audience doesn't ask any questions, and are instead blinded and awed by the nostalgia of the original Ghostbusters being back on screen together. Don't ask how these three characters somehow got to Oklahoma within an hour's notice of the world going to shit, or let alone someone asking these three characters for help, because that doesn't happen in the movie. They basically materialize for a contrived entrance instead of allowing the characters we've been following to solve the problem themselves. Or looking at Matrix Resurrections, which, small spoilers, the writers make it to where the machines bring back Neo and Trinity from the dead because their love for each other generates a lot of power? Like, what? If bringing back characters is so far-fetched that it physically doesn't make sense within your own movie, then you need to leave them alone. The only time it's right to bring them back is if it's purposeful and follows the movie's internal logic. Otherwise, it comes across as the studio wanting to cash in on the nostalgia. For the last pillar of great fan service, you can't rely on nostalgia-inducing references for entertainment. In small doses, I think it's fine, especially if it's plausible for the reference to be made in the first place. Like when Peter Parker is talking about how he'll be making cures to save the villains, and Mr. Osborn chips in to say this.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
Yes, that obviously references the meme, but it can be forgivable since the topic is on science, and he genuinely wants to help. However, once you start to use references repeatedly, it drastically lowers the news story experience because we are constantly anchored down in the past. The worst offender of this is Ghostbusters Afterlife. Practically a third of the movie is our new characters discovering old props and callbacks to the first Ghostbusters movie. Since our new characters inherited Egon's house and he raided the Ghostbusters and stole all their equipment, the writers sent our main characters into a scavenger hunt of nostalgia. Every scene is imbued with the essence of the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing meme, or the Soy Jack pointing meme as he gushes about something he just found. During these scenes, the plot hits a standstill because there's no story development in the concept of our characters walking around and gawking at props from the first movie. And there's an even more egregious example where Paul Rudd is in Walmart for no reason other than to get food, and he runs into mini Stay Puft Marshmallow Men. None of the other food or products in Walmart are being affected by paranormal activity, and it's just coincidentally the marshmallows. It comes across as the filmmakers injecting this stupid reference for cheap nostalgia, and even worse, a forced merchandising advertisement. If you thought the Porgs were bad, then you'll love the mini Stay Puft Marshmallows. These references should be second nature as the story takes a priority. Like in Spider-Man No Way Home, the characters make references that can easily fall over the head of casual fans. While getting ready for the third act battle, Tobey Maguire goes on about how his back hurts, and Andrew Garfield offers to crack it. During the moment, this comes across as brotherly bonding between characters that desperately need love and appreciation in their lives. To my surprise, this was actually a reference to Spider-Man 2 where he hurt his back, and this moment acts as a kind of Easter egg. So as long as the references aren't distracting and aren't hindering the story with a massive nostalgia roadblock, then it can definitely work. Or you can go the crazy Matrix Resurrections route, where the movie becomes a meta-comedy about cashing on the Matrix franchise, where they make tons of references and the movie weirdly becomes self-aware. If you don't break these three rules for fanservice, then it can definitely work within the movie. I'm just tired of so many franchises falling victim to this, and it comes across as studios and writers barely trying anymore, and think that as long as you are experiencing nostalgia, then you won't notice the movie's glaring flaws.